Leaders continue to address major world issues at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. And as the crisis in the Middle East escalates, we have an in-depth interview with Egypt's foreign minister. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The United Nations General Assembly has heard from global leaders this week on a wide range of critical issues. Meanwhile, this year's UNGA is taking place as conflict rages in the Middle East. The Egyptian foreign minister sat down with CGTN in New York to give his perspective on the crisis. He also addressed other topics that impact his country, including relations with China. Later in the show, we will also bring you an interview with the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. But we begin with the Egyptian Foreign Minister, Badr Abdelatty. He talked with my colleague, Elaine Reyes.
Minister Abdelatty, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for hosting me.
The UN General Assembly is being held right now at a time of rising conflict and geopolitical rivalry. Egypt has been working very hard for a long time now to de-escalate the conflict in Gaza. Now we see that there have been strikes in Lebanon on Hezbollah by Israel. And I want to get your thoughts on how concerned you are about that escalation.
Well, of course, we are extremely concerned with the current situation in our region and the high tension. And there is a big possibility to drag the whole region into a full-fledged regional war. So that's why we are pushing very hard for de-escalation. We are against and we are condemning all kinds of unilateral and provocative actions, and including the policy of assassination. That's condemned by the government of Egypt. And we are working very hard for de-escalation. And we are with the view that, we have to address the root causes of the problems in our neighborhood, which is the ongoing aggression on Gaza. And that's why we have to focus more and more and not to divert attention from the core of the conflict by pushing for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Egypt, as you know, in cooperation with Qatar and the United States, we are exerting intensive efforts over the last 10 months, working hard day by day in order to reach a deal to secure the release of all hostages and, of course, an immediate ceasefire and exchange of prisoners and the detainees from the Palestinian side, and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. So, of course, we have to work together. We are working with regional powers, with global powers, including beside the United States. We are working with China, with Russia, with India, with Brazil, with all different regional and global powers, with one objective: to push for an immediate ceasefire and to strike a deal on Gaza to release all hostages. And that's, of course, a major guarantee for de-escalation, and not to give excuse to any country or non-state actor to exploit the suffering of the Palestinians in order to promote a specific agenda.
You said in a press conference recently that if there is a political will, it will be possible to reach a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, both Israel and Hamas have been blaming each other for not being able to reach that ceasefire. What are some of the big obstacles that still remain?
We are working very, very hard, as I mentioned, with the Americans, with the Qataris. There are only two pending issues in order to reach an agreement on the ceasefire. It's, as you correctly mentioned, it's the lack of political will. And that's why we are in close contacts with the Americans, with the international community, in order to apply more pressure to achieve this immediate ceasefire, and not to drag the whole region into a regional war. As I mentioned before, there is lack of political will. Whenever we reach the moment of truth to reach a ceasefire, policies of provocations, of unilateralism by conducting political assassinations, by targeting, specific figures in Lebanon, in Iran, in the region. That's, of course, not creating conducive environment and diverting the attention from the main objective, which is focusing on an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. That's why, with the lack of political will in one party, I believe that it's difficult to reach this deal. But anyway, we will continue our extensive efforts in order to push for an immediate ceasefire to stop the bloodshed and the killings of innocent civilians in Gaza.
You bring unique perspective to this situation. You have a long career in diplomacy, but you worked at the Egyptian embassy in Israel. You were also director of Palestinian affairs at the foreign ministry. So what do you think you can bring to the situation as these negotiations continue? And are you optimistic about it?
Unfortunately, I stopped to be optimistic, because, as I mentioned, we reached the moment of truth to reach a deal many times. But whenever we're being very close, one party is backing off. So, according to our experiences, we need 2 or 3 conditions in order to have more conducive environment for moving ahead. One is, of course, the political will must be there. And secondly, applying more pressure from the international community, because without that, unfortunately, you are leaving everything to one party to decide and maybe to take the whole region hostage to a specific narrow-minded political agenda. That's why more coordinated efforts from the international community is extremely important. And thirdly, of course, adherence to the principles enshrined in the UN Charter and international humanitarian law and the international law. And this is the responsibility of the international community to push for it, because public opinion in our region is extremely angry with what they perceived as hypocrisy, sometimes as double standard when it comes to the issue of Gaza, because they are a human being like others. And why we are not moving, not intervening. Now we are exceeding 41,000 innocent people who've been killed in Gaza, 75% of them women and the children. We have more than 15,000 Palestinians under the rubbles. Also, in addition to 80% of the Palestinians, we are talking about 1.7 million people, they are internally displaced. Also, 100,000 people being injured. So, why we are waiting why the international community is not intervening in order to push for the application of the international law principles, and also not to give impunity to any party. We have the measures taken by the ICG, the International Court of Justice, that should be implemented. We have a Security Council resolution on the ceasefire that should be implemented. We have also the recent General Assembly resolution vis-a-vis the ICG measures. So those are, measures taken by the international community, by the ICG, by the Security Council, by the General Assembly, and they are not implemented on the ground. That's why a lot of people lost faith in multilateralism, in what's so-called rules-based order on international law, and that's very, very troubling and very worrying if we are talking about a world with peace and security. And as you correctly mentioned at the outset, you know, issue of polarization and is extremely dangerous. And if we are now losing faith in the UN system and the multilateralism, that's very, very risky and could lead the whole world community into a total chaos. And of course, that does not serve the interest of anybody.
Antonio Guterres calling for more reform at the United Nations in regards to multilateralism, saying it needs to be pulled back from the brink. Is there anything more the UN can do in this situation? Because there is, as you point out, a lot of frustration around it.
Yes, of course. I mean, first of all, we commend the Secretary General of the United Nations. He's a man of principles, because he's speaking out and he's expressing the conscience of the people in the world. The UN has, of course, to implement. I mean, there is a paralyzed Security Council. We have, as I mentioned, a Security Council resolution without implementation. Another resolutions by General Assembly without implementation. We have ICG findings without implementation. That's something very, very troubling and worrying. And that, as I mentioned, many people, many countries lost faith on multilateralism, and that's very dangerous. So we have to implement what was agreed upon. We have a lot of resolutions with regard to the two-state solution. We have parameters agreed by the international community without implementation. So it's timely now for recognizing the state of Palestine. Now the two-state solution is an empty slogan. Everybody is using it, you know, in order to wash their hands, you know, of the current catastrophic crisis in Gaza and in the West Bank. And that's why we have the state of Israel, which is being recognized by the world. So we don't have to talk about two-state solution. We have to talk about implementation of and the establishment of the Palestinian state on the territories occupied on the 4th of June 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital. This is what was agreed upon internationally, and it's timely to have the political will to implement what was agreed upon in order to restore the credibility of the whole UN system and multilateralism, as Secretary General of the UN mentioned before.
African countries are demanding 2 seats on the UN Security Council as permanent members. What are your thoughts on that? Could that help in any way?
Yes, of course. We have to lift the historical injustice on Africa. Africa is a great continent, and we deserve better understanding, better representation in the UN, and to lift this historical injustice. We have the Africa Consensus, of course, as it was presented in the CERT declaration, and then a Zolini Consensus. It's not only 2 permanent seats, but also in addition to another 2 unpermanent seats of the Security Council. This is a great continent, more than 54 countries. We must have representation in the UN system, in the Security Council, because you cannot talk about reforming the governance of the UN system without reforming the Security Council, and we deserve this representation with 4 seats, 2 permanent and 2 non-permanent. So we will continue to work together as African countries in order to achieve this objective, to lift this historical injustice.
Egypt's president visited China earlier this year. He signed cooperation agreements with Chinese President Xi Jinping that coincided with the 10th anniversary of the Egypt-China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. Also a big player in the Belt and Road Initiative. Talk to us about this relationship between these two ancient civilizations.
Well, we value, of course, our very close relationship with China and its strategic nature. As you correctly mentioned, we are now celebrating this year the 10th anniversary of the launching of our strategic partnership with China. And don't forget the fact that Egypt was the first Arab and African countries to recognize the People's Republic of China in 1956. So we are proud of this. As you correctly mentioned, we are two major and great ancient civilizations, the Egyptian civilization and the Chinese civilizations. We have to build on this solid foundation to do more with regard, of course, further deepening and enhancing our bilateral cooperation on everything, on political consultation, the exchange of visits between our two leaders, our two countries. Also, the ministerial consultations. I'm going to meet with my dear friend, the Foreign Minister of China here in New York, and after that I'm going to visit Beijing in order to build on our friendship to further enhance cooperation. We have also diversified relationship on trade, on industry, on also on investment. We value the presence of consortium of Chinese companies in the Suez Canal Economic Zone led by TIDA, the great Chinese company. We also value the presence of Chinese companies in Egypt, in the Egyptian economy, and especially in the new capital city in Cairo, in Egypt. The government now is moving to the new capital city. It's something unbelievable. We did it in very few years, and we have the iconic tower there, which is built with Chinese expertise. This is the highest tower in Africa. Also, we have cultural contacts and interactions with China. And we, as I mentioned, we value this strategic relationship, and we need to do more and more, because China is a huge, big, important country and a global power, and Egypt is a major and big and great regional power, and we're representing two great civilizations. So with the common interest and the common objectives, we can do more and more for the benefits of the two friendly countries, leaders, and peoples, of course.
Foreign Minister Abdelatty, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
The International Committee of the Red Cross has long played an important role helping victims in conflicts across the globe. Now it's adapting to what's happening in places like Ukraine, Gaza, and Sudan. My colleague Sean Caleb's talked recently with the ICRC president, Mirjana Spoljaric.
Mirjana, so good to see you. Thanks for coming in. I want to begin. The ICRC has played a critical role in conflict zones globally. How is the organization adapting to the increasing complexities of conflicts, such as those in Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza, that have really dominated the UNGA agenda so far this year?
The ICRC is an organization that is 160 years old, so this organization has seen the First and the Second World War. However, what we see today is a compilation, an adding of high-intensity conflicts that all seem to escalate at high pace and converging in terms of challenges that we face. So the intensity and the scale of the conflicts that we see today, the ripple effects and the speed with which they evolve pose a high risk not only for us as humanitarian workers, but for the world as a whole.
Yeah, and I've spent a decent amount of time in hostile environments, and I've seen the amazing, often heroic work that your organization does up close. And so given the strained relationships among major powers right now, How does the geopolitical tension impact the ICRC's neutrality and its ability to constantly deliver humanitarian aid in conflict zones?
Our neutrality is not impacted and it will not bend. It is unconditional because it's a conditio sine qua non for our work to continue and for us to be able to implement our mandate. And it is precisely in such times that you need neutral actors like the ICRC, and the powers need these actors. However, what we see is a shrinking humanitarian space on the ground. What we see is politicization of humanitarian assistance, and this has to stop. And here, the states, and especially the great powers, bear responsibility to make sure that this does not continue and that we can operate and that we can reach the civilian population that is affected by armed violence and armed conflict.
The UNGA 2024 is focused on the Summit of the Future and the development of a global digital compact. How does the ICRC plan to incorporate digital innovations into its humanitarian work?
We've been investing a lot in innovation to support our humanitarian action on the ground, but we are also in the process of implementing a large and system-wide digital transformation strategy to make our systems and operations more efficient and more adapted to today's realities. That's the good side of it. Now, the challenging side of it is that new technologies, artificial intelligence, impact how wars are fought, how military operations are conducted. And we have to take this into account too, because new technologies can amplify the destructive and violent potential of weapon systems. And so we always have to make sure that states that employ such weapon systems still remain in compliance with international humanitarian law and their legal obligations.
Now, China plays a significant role in global humanitarian efforts, especially in regions affected by conflict as well as natural disasters. How does the ICRC collaborate with China, and what opportunities do you really see for expanding this partnership moving forward?
China is an important supporter of the International Committee of the Red Cross. We have had traditionally a very close cooperation with China, but also with the Chinese Red Cross Society. What we have done over the last year, and following my visit to China in September last year and my meeting with President Xi, is we have significantly intensified this dialogue, and we are working much more closely together to see how China can, through relevant initiatives, help us improve the implementation and the respect for international humanitarian law globally, and especially in the different contexts where we operate.
Mirjana, thank you so much. It's good to see you, and best of luck with all the important work that your organization continues to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving now to another issue, the environment. Plastic pollution is a major problem, but there are efforts underway to tackle that. My colleague, Sean Caleb's, also talked with Jyoti Mathur-Filipp. She's Executive Secretary of the UN Committee for Plastics Pollution at the United Nations Environment Programme.
Jyoti, so good to see you. Thanks so much for coming in. I want to begin by talking about what has been achieved so far in the process, and what is the process, including challenges that are in the plastics treaty negotiations.
Thank you so much for inviting me. So we are in the middle of a plastic treaty negotiation to tackle plastic pollution, because the problem is huge. We as human beings are creating 500 million metric tons of plastic every year, of which 400 is ending up in the environment. And so the UN member states got together and said that we must have a treaty, a legally binding treaty, to tackle plastic pollution. We started this in 2022. We've had 4 sessions, and we are now going to our 5th and final session in Busan in the Republic of Korea, where the gavel will go down on an agreement on a legally binding instrument. Challenges, there are many. Multilateralism is not a straight process. We have lots and lots of, issues among the 193 member states, and they have to come together. They have to compromise and come to an agreement very soon. So lots of challenges.
And Jyoti, there has been so much work by individuals, by NGOs, by governments. So what work needs to be done over the next 8 weeks until the 5th and final session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, INC5, and that will take place in Busan, I believe, on November 25th?
Yes, that's correct. So my view is that a lot of work needs to be done by taking an all-of-society approach. Everybody who is in, from private sector to youth to indigenous people, everyone must raise their voice, amplify it so that governments can hear that there is a need for this treaty to be agreed in Busan. We have a lot of things that we are doing, through the multilateral intergovernmental process, but we need voices to be raised so that there is enough of a crescendo and voices are amplified by the time we reach Busan, so that we can agree on the final text.
I think that's a perfect way to put it, sort of bringing this to a culmination, because voices have been raised now for decades about single use. So how and why does the treaty address the plastic pollution crisis with the life cycle of plastics from production to disposal? Obviously, a lot of pushback from the fossil fuels entity, oil. So why is there a focus on single use now and short-lived plastic products?
Actually, the treaty is attempting to address the full life cycle of plastic, which includes single-use and short-lived. But we are also looking at design so that plastic products remain in circularity, either for refill systems, reuse systems, or they get disposed of appropriately. So we're not only looking at single-use, we're looking at a systemic change, so that there's transformation in how we deal with plastic. We're not against plastic as such. We are against plastic pollution, but we need to make our plastic more usable and in use for a much longer time than currently. So we are looking at a life cycle approach.
And to put this in perspective, we know out in the ocean there are floating islands of plastic that are several kilometers wide. I lived in Afghanistan for a year, and so many plastic bags blew in the trees. They called them Afghan flowers. So I understand what you're talking about. No one's trying to completely do away with plastic, just improve the way that it has been operating. So talk about the negotiation process. How is it fostering cooperation between countries, the members of the committee, and what are they doing to address these differing challenges globally that everyone's facing?
So I think there are lots of ways that member states are looking at this. Well, we, of course, have the intergovernmental negotiating process going on right now, in which they have to negotiate, member states have to negotiate their positions and come to a compromise. But I also think they have already started, from 2008 at least, they have started taking national measures, getting rid of single-use bags, straws, forks and knives. So many countries have already started doing this. Their national legislation is changing, and they have to come to an agreement in Busan on how they can all work towards this. So I think that lots of work is ongoing, but lots of work still to do.
Jyoti, Mathur-Filipp, we can't thank you enough. I know it's going to be an important couple of months for you. Good luck leading up to Busan.
Thank you.
And that's it for another edition of The Heat. Thanks for being with us.